Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at ianmasters.com. And joining us now is Ambassador Alexander Sandy Vershbow, who is a Distinguished Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council and the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016. He served for 3 years as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, was a career member of the United States Foreign Service, and also served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO and to the Russian Federation. Welcome to Background Briefing, Alexander Vershbow. And the EU's 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957 concluded in Rome with a general feeling that, well, I guess it's a sort of conditional optimism because of the absence of the UK, which of all the 27 countries present, the UK was not there because the Prime Minister is involved in the Brexit exit, which the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker called a tragedy. There's clearly a connection between Brexit and the Trump administration, as much as many of the same people, the same tech, the same electronic tactics were used. There was a confluence in terms of the campaign organizations and tactics and sophisticated electronics, etc. So what is happening in the general sense that's very hard to follow? I don't, for the life of me, know what the point of Brexit was, and I don't understand what the Trump administration's doing in trashing allies and undermining alliances while making excuses for adversaries.
Well, those are important questions, and I think in the case of Brexit, it reflects kind of the same rejection of the status quo on the part of disadvantaged parts of the population who are looking to scapegoat, the traditional elites, the establishment. I think those are the same kind of people that were attracted to Donald Trump in our election and contributed to the slight majority for Brexit in the UK. Whether it was really well thought through is less clear. But there's a kind of a we're fed up and we're not going to take it anymore attitude that was reflected in these two votes. As for why is the Trump administration trashing traditional allies, that may be a bit strong, but I think it's clear that the Trump administration doesn't attach the proper significance to a unified Europe in a very dangerous world. If we're going to deal with an aggressive Russia, with ISIS, with these difficult side effects of globalization, we need to band together. And a strong European Union will be a much better partner for the United States in dealing with these problems than a fragmented Europe that is much more prey to Russian disinformation, to radical ideas, left or right. So I hope the Trump administration will wake up and recognize that it needs a strong Europe rather than trying to encourage other countries to follow Britain's lead.
Well, the German Chancellor, who, of course, was recently here in Washington, Angela Merkel, said that we want to go in the same direction, and there are some things that are non-negotiable, like the single market, the four basic freedoms that are our values of liberty, of freedom of opinion, of freedom of speech, of freedom of press, of freedom of religion, and that makes us strong, and we shall not compromise on that. There was a sense when Merkel was visiting Washington that maybe she's becoming the leader of the free world, for the want of a better description, in as much as the statement that she just made in Rome. In other words, are we somehow relinquishing that kind of basic moral leadership about what democracy stands for? Because the struggle seems to be in this world is not between capitalism and communism anymore. It's between democracy and autocracy.
Well, I share that concern. I mean, I don't think it's a done deal yet, but certainly the initial moves of the Trump administration don't inspire confidence that it really understands the responsibility that comes with being the leader of the free world, of defending freedom, not just freedom for the United States to renegotiate trade deals or build walls, but the freedom that has to stand as a strong alternative to the authoritarianism represented by today's Russia or the nihilistic radicalism of terrorist groups like ISIS. So if the U.S. doesn't lead, Chancellor Merkel may have no alternative but to try to fill the gap. She's done a pretty good job in leading Europe in the last few years, getting through the financial crisis and the risk of a Grexit. But and she's, of course, held Europe together in standing up to Russian aggression in Ukraine, at least in keeping the sanctions from getting violated by some of the less enthusiastic members. But ultimately, Europe needs the U.S. as much as the U.S. needs Europe, and we have to work together, forge a common strategy, try to bring Russia back to the rules of the game rather than becoming a serial violator of those rules.
Of course, one of the strangest things in trying to follow this political moment we're in is how much there is a kind of topsy-turvy nature of the normal traditional political positions on the left and the right, not just in Europe, but here in the United States. For example, many liberals who have always been suspicious of the military-industrial complex, of the CIA, etc., they're in many ways sort of hoping that the CIA will find the evidence to impeach the president. And then on the right, you've got people who are normally kind of who wear the American flag pins and are very throughout the Cold War were hawks, and now they're making excuses for Putin. So what's happening in terms of this strange lack of outrage in this country about the idea, it's not an idea, it's a fact, that Russia, in effect, conducted a cyber version of a Pearl Harbor attack on American democracy itself in the last election?
Well, I'm afraid what you say is true, and it's a sort of a reflection of the increasingly tribal nature of American politics. Our two parties have become extremely polarized against one another. There's no such thing as a conservative Democrat or a moderate Republican anymore, or it almost seems that way. And so to the extent that the Russians may have helped President Trump get elected, undermines the legitimacy of that victory in the eyes of his diehard supporters, and maybe in the minds of the president himself. And so it leads them to try to kind of deny the evidence that's staring them in the face about Russia's deep involvement and interference in our election. And of course, the Democrats, it's the mirror image of that. Angry over what happened in November, they're seizing on the Russian factor to show that the election was somehow tainted, and making Putin look like the enemy number one to the United States. I actually think, objectively speaking, the Kremlin is becoming much more menacing than it was even during the height of the Cold War, using these kinds of subversive tactics much more skillfully than they ever did during communist times. So we do have to get to the bottom of what they did, but at the same time recognize that our society is still very strong, and if we take the necessary precautions, the Russians won't be able to get away with this in the future.
Well, broadly speaking, I think you're talking about soft power, Alexander Vershbow, and it would seem to me that, it's often been said that it wasn't so much the U.S. nuclear arsenal that brought down the Berlin Wall, but MTV and rock and roll and whatever else. So how do you explain what seems to be happening, at least in terms of the budget outlines, where $54 billion extra goes to the Defense Department and about 30 or 29% or so of the State Department budget gets cut, most of which is what is loosely called soft power. So could you make the argument, as you just alluded to, that Russia has perfected a form of not so much soft power, but certainly less than military means to project power through hybrid warfare, through information campaigns, through surrogates, etc., whereas while they are perfecting that form of hybrid warfare, we're unilaterally disarming in terms of soft power?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's certainly true that the Cold War ended not so much because of our military superiority, although we, I think, did get the Russians to spend their money on the wrong things, but it was really the superiority of our political and economic system. The Russian people could see with their own eyes, and eventually the Russian leadership, led by Mikhail Gorbachev, recognized that the system itself was failing, and that they needed to open up the society, liberalize the economy if they were going to have any chance of surviving. So in a sense, our soft power projected very effectively through our culture, through rock and roll, through jazz, through the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, helped win without having to fire a shot. Of course, the Russian soft power today is kind of perverse, because their aim is to weaken their neighbors, to demoralize the West, to divide the United States and Europe, to undermine the European Union. They feel more secure when their neighbors are in a shambles, whereas I think the United States, for the most part, together with its European allies, has tried to help countries that are joining the world of democracies that have overcome totalitarian dictatorships in the past, help them become stable and prosperous societies. You know, we think having strong partners is the way to go. But yes, cutting the State Department budget by 29% is like tying both of your hands behind your back in terms of trying to use America's advantages most effectively. Diplomacy, targeted foreign assistance that's very conditional on reforms and fighting corruption. All these things can make the world a much more stable and prosperous place and prevent the need to go in with large-scale military forces when things fall apart. So it's a very false economy. You save a little, really pennies in cutting the State Department, but you're going to end up spending when you have to intervene, as we've had to do many times militarily.
So what's happening then at the State Department? Because Secretary of State Rex Tillerson more or less agreed that he could go along with these cuts, and then he raised eyebrows when he canceled the upcoming NATO meeting, but still is planning on going to Russia. Now, apparently there's been some pushback, and he's found that he can actually reschedule the NATO meeting, but the signal's been sent. So what do you think's happening in terms of, one, his credibility or clout within the Trump administration, and two, his priorities?
It's a little disturbing that, first of all, that he hasn't fleshed out his team. He has they've announced a Deputy Secretary of State, but that'll take some months before that man is confirmed. We still have no names for all the other senior policy-making positions in the State Department. So he's a bit handicapped, especially as he's very new to this business. He's not an experienced diplomat himself. So I worry that if a crisis erupts, he just won't have the brain power to help him advise the president effectively. It was a mistake to blow off the NATO meeting. I'm glad it has now been rescheduled. It's both a symbolic error in that the U.S. is the leader of NATO. This is the first meeting in his tenure. It's a month before there's going to be a small summit meeting where President Trump will meet his counterparts. So this was a golden opportunity to establish relationships with the counterparts and lay out the agenda. What do we want to get out of this first summit meeting? Where does the administration want to go with NATO? So at least that's back on the agenda. All the more important because if he's going to go to Russia in April, he needs to consult with his allies first. We can't go off and propose things to the Russians that could cause great distress, if not a split within NATO. So better to start with the allies and forge a united front before you head on a plane to Moscow.
But in terms of what we were talking about a minute ago, in terms of Russia's perfection of, or certainly sophistication in terms of hybrid warfare and soft power, and how the Cold War ended largely because of MTV and rock and roll, etc. There was huge demonstrations in Moscow and around Russia, which were illegal according to the government. Navalny, the opposition leader who was recently had green paint thrown in his face, so people in the demonstrations were putting green paint on. But the refrain was basically, Putin is a thief, etc. And there's a certain. I remember the collapse of the USSR and the former Soviet Union. I spent a lot of time there, and there is a similarity. Back then, the Russian people were just absolutely fed up with the Communist Party, which they considered entirely corrupt, and you had to deal with the black market in order to get by in any case. And they use the word mafia in reference to the fat cats in the Communist Party who were living off the fat of the land while they were lining up around the block for a piece of stringy chicken in a otherwise empty store. And it seems like we're sort of, it's Groundhog Day here. They're going back to that sense. I'm not suggesting it's anything like the level it was in the late 80s, but it's starting to build. So I'm not convinced about being so afraid of Putin in terms of moving into Western Europe. Already, basically, in picking a fight with the Ukrainians, it seems that throughout that whole region, an awakening on the part of people that they don't want to be ruled by gangsters. They didn't want to be ruled by Yanukovych. He's a gangster. The guy they put in Crimea is a gangster. The guy that runs Belarus is a gangster. He just cracked heads in a demonstration that they tried to have. I don't think democracy and the yearning for freedom is in any way dead in that part of the world. And I'm not sure that over the long haul that Putin's going to win.
I think you're right. Putin is desperately afraid of his own people. That's one reason he has so tightly controlled the mass media in Russia, shut down non-governmental organizations, basically demonized anybody who opposes him as a traitor, as a fifth columnist, because he sees what happens in countries close to Russia with the same background as Russia, that the people don't put up with this sort of repression and the bleak standard of living for very long. I mean, the people in Ukraine weren't rising up against Russia. They were rising up for freedom, for a chance to hold their leaders accountable, to root out the corruption which had become endemic. But of course, that was the kind of system that Russia still has. So he is afraid of seeing positive examples springing up along Russia's borders. So that's all the more reason why we in the West, without necessarily looking like we're out to destabilize or undermine the Russian government, but we should stand up for what we believe in. We should fund the State Department for programs that promote democratization, that fight corruption, promote the rule of law, because this is ultimately what's going to lead to a more prosperous world and in the end, a safer world for U.S. interests. So it's a good investment, and that's why it's sad that Rex Tillerson has accepted these deep cuts in the State Department's budget without more of a fight.
Well, just in closing, though, a Russian lawmaker who was very close to Putin and to Putin's inner circle went to Ukraine, in effect defected, was about to testify against Yanukovych, the ousted kleptocrat from Ukraine, who, by the way, had hired Paul Manafort and paid him a lot of money to improve his image, and apparently there was quite a close relationship there. Paul Manafort, it's worth noting, was Donald Trump's campaign manager, and this Russian lawmaker was about to testify against Yanukovych with the inside knowledge from the Russian side, and he was shot dead brazenly in Kiev. So I just find it incredibly disturbing that people on our side who, had very prominent roles, particularly in this recent election, are shilling for this guy, this dictator who they obviously, Putin's hitman just killed a guy who was about to testify against him. This feels like, Chicago in the 1920s.
Yeah, well, it's pretty upsetting, and this fellow, this parliamentarian Voronenkov, clearly was a whistleblower, and somebody didn't want him to testify against Yanukovych. And given what Mr. Putin did to Litvinenko a few years ago with the polonium poisoning right in downtown London, the suspicion certainly points in the direction of Moscow as being behind this. But I think what you said about how this may have affected our own election underscores the importance of having a real serious bipartisan investigation. Some of the first moves by the House Intelligence Committee didn't inspire total confidence that it's going to be truly bipartisan and objective. But we need to allow these things to run their course so we know whether people with backgrounds connecting them to Putin or to Yanukovych, did things that are not in keeping with our laws or our democratic traditions. In some ways, this is a bigger threat than terrorism, in the sense that our institutions have been assaulted, and so we have to make sure that whatever steps we need to take to prevent it from happening again are taken quickly before the next election 2 years from now.
Well, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Very welcome.
And again, I've been speaking with Alexander Sandy Vershbow, who's a distinguished fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security at the Atlantic Council. He's a former Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016, and he served for 3 years as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, was a career member of the United States Foreign Service, and also served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO and to the Russian Federation.